Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 most disappointing cards from the Witchwood. And when I say disappointing, what I mean is that these cards were overrated by the community and often by myself as well. People named these cards as some of the very best in the set or the most likely to succeed, but in fact these cards just aren't seeing all that much play at the moment this early in the Witchwood meta. Now, I'm not saying that these cards are necessarily terrible, and in fact I think a few of them could be good in the future. They have some fundamental attributes and characteristics which seem like they'll eventually find a home or become strong cards in a different meta, or if a different deck archetype pops up to support them. But nonetheless, despite that, right now they're just not seeing the play to substantiate how highly they were ranked in the preseason polls. Now that said, how I determine the cards on this list is by going to the Vicious Syndicate pre-release poll. They asked a ton of Hearthstone players to rate all cards from 1 to 5 stars. I took cards within the top 15 spots of those rankings. So only cards which people thought were going to be essentially almost in the top 10% of all cards, a little more than that, but the top 15 spots. And then I compared that to the actual spot each of these cards is ranked in a playability standpoint in Hearthstone today. In other words, based on the percentage of decks in which they're run, and determine the difference between those two numbers. So for instance, if you thought a card was going to be the number 1 card in the set and it was actually the 135th card in the set, that would be remarkably disappointing because it went from first to last, and that would be an enormous difference. Of course, none of these cards fall quite that far, but many of them are certainly played far, far less than any of us imagined. That said, let's go ahead and jump into these rankings. Up first here, I have Ark Mage for Mage. This guy was ranked 11th among all Witchwood cards by the community, and when it comes to his play rate right now, he's actually the 54th most played card in all of the Witchwood. And just to set some context, the Witchwood on average is a bit of a weaker expansion than normal. So for it to be the 54th worst card, that's really, really bad. This thing is not showing up in any great decks right now, certainly not any very high tier decks. I did just play this in like a Murloc Mage that's okay, but most of the time, a vast majority of the time in fact, Aragal is just not being played hardly at all. There are some fringe ways to occasionally make him work, but clearly he is not the 11th best card in the set by any means. That's 43 spots lower than he was ranked. Now, I too gave this card 5 stars, and frankly, I still think Aragal's going to be a solid card at some point. He's just too cheap, and he offers too much draw value to not find a home eventually, and of course, he has some synergy pieces already released, and there might be even more in the future. So, despite how far he's fallen from his pre-release estimations here, I still think Aragal will make the cut eventually, so disappointing for now, but I don't think he'll stay disappointing for long. Moving on to our next card here, we have Hound Master Sha. And this guy was ranked 13th, so just outside the top 10, much like Aragal. But his actual ranking based on his play rate at this point is 56th. So once again, actually a fall of 43 spots. And again, 56th is just not very meaningful. I know there will be people out there who say, well, Hound Master Sha is really good. I have found a deck that makes him work. And again, I kind of agree with you. I think there are some fundamental strengths to Hound Master Sha. I think eventually he's going to be amazing, but right now, there just aren't any good or popular decks playing Hound Master Sha. You might want to argue with me about that, but if you go to the data, he's the 56th most played card in the expansion. That's really low in a weak expansion. Frankly, that's low in any expansion, but in the Witchwood in particular, that is pretty abysmally low. Nobody right now is playing this card in any sort of substantial or significant way. Now, I gave this card 4 stars as well. I wasn't quite as high on it as perhaps the community on average, since this would not have been in my top 15 for all cards by any means. Probably would have landed around 25th, 30th, somewhere around there. But I still overrated and overestimated Hound Master Sha as well. It has been disappointing to me. Part of that might be the somewhat lack of success for Hunter right now. Hunter is just not very good. And of course, that makes it a challenge for Hound Master Sha to see play if Hunter's not seeing much play. That said, a lot of us thought this could drive some of the new powerful stuff that Hunter had available and help it make the cut. And frankly, if this card's not good enough to make Hunter better, it's probably not the 13th best card in the set. So again, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad card, just that it hasn't lived up to its expectations so far. Now up next we have Book of Specters, and I'm actually surprised when I saw how high this one was ranked. The community named this the 7th best card in the pre-release poll. People absolutely loved the idea of Book of Specters. I didn't realize it was so darn beloved. Unfortunately, it is the 61st most played card, so the lowest we've seen yet, and also the biggest drop, of course, because I am putting these in order from smallest drop to largest drop, but that's a 54 spot decline there, so much worse than people expected. Now, I wasn't as high on Book of Specters. I gave it 3 stars, which means I thought it was a playable card, but certainly not one that we'd see often, nor, of course, would it be meta-defining, just playable. And frankly, I think that's about right. 61st is a little less than halfway through all of the cards in the expansion. 3 stars is basically halfway. This feels like kind of a 2.5 to 3 star card to me, probably really more like a 2.5 star card at this point if I were to break it down into smaller increments. So I probably overrated this a little bit myself, although certainly not as much as the Vicious Syndicate community at large. Now, I understand why people thought it was going to be good, of course, because 3 cards for 2 mana is amazing. There are ways to build successful minion-based decks with things like Spiteful Summoner, for instance. That was probably one path people saw for this. I have played Book of Specters myself recently in that Murloc Mage I just mentioned with Ark Mage. Clearly, people believed in this minion mage plan, whether it was Elemental or Spiteful or Murloc or whatever else. People thought it was going to work because 2 of the cards that borrow that same archetype showed up on this list. But clearly that hasn't worked yet. Now, again, I'm not saying Book of Specters is bad. I actually think this card will be solid. I think it'll be a 3 or 4 star card eventually. Right now, though, pretty darn disappointing. A top 10 card by belief, but in reality, barely made the top half of the expansion. And then here at the number 2 spot, we have a card most people would probably consider the most overrated of the entire expansion, and there's certainly an argument to be made for that. This is Countess Ashmore. She was ranked 3rd among all cards in the pre-release poll, but in actuality, she is only the 64th most played card in all of the Witchwood. And again, that's about halfway down the expansion, a little better than the top half. But that is very bad for a card that we all thought was going to be amazing. Of course, I gave Ashmore 5 stars. I named her the 2nd best legendary in the expansion. She probably would have made my top 5 cards. Probably, honestly, top 3 cards for me, too, if I had done a list of the best cards and not just the best legendaries. So I fell victim to the exact same overrating mistake that everybody else did as well. Everything about Countess Ashmore looks amazing. Great stats for her cost. She draws a ton of cards. She can implement a ton of different synergies and combine them all together really nicely. And frankly, I have played a little bit of Countess Ashmore, and I've liked her. I thought she was a good card when I played her, and sometimes she seems like a really solid play. In fact, I played her earlier today in a Rush Warrior deck, and it was awesome. But nonetheless, she still hasn't made her way into a super high-tier deck, nor a very popular deck. So when it comes to her play rate, it's still disastrously low. None of the best decks are finding excuses to run Countess Ashmore, and she's certainly not strong enough to build a deck around either. So that leaves her in a spot where she's just not being played very often. Once again, I think she's going to be good. She will have a time in the spotlight eventually. Someday in Hearthstone, there's going to be a deck that makes this one work, but for now, she has been an utter and enormous disappointment. But believe it or not, there's one card that took an even bigger fall than Countess Ashmore, because at the end of the day, there are still some people dropping Countess Ashmore into a deck. There are still people making her work. Like I said, I played her myself today. But there's one card that fell even farther, and it is, as you can see here, Coffin Crasher. This was ranked 10th by the community, so they thought it was going to be one of the top 10 cards in the expansion, but in reality, It is the 94th most played card in all of the Witchwood. So it fell a total of 84 spots below its expected result. And that is an enormous descent. It is a complete and utter failure compared to what people expected out of Coffin Crasher. Now, I only gave Coffin Crasher 3 stars. So I gotta be honest, I probably overrated it too, because 3 stars is not the 94th best card in the expansion. That's almost in the bottom quarter of all cards. Like, in a bad expansion, that is just unbelievably, terribly unpopular and unplayable. So even 3 stars is too good. This very clearly looks like a 2-star card, kind of a definition of a 2-star card in my mind. Arguably, in some cases, you could even maybe push for a 1-star, but I think 2-star is right. So I overrated it, but I definitely didn't think this was one of the top 10 cards in the entire expansion. That is mind-boggling to me. I don't know why people thought this was going to be so good. Maybe they thought it was going to be like the second coming of a big priest deck with like obsidian statues and cheating out some Coffin Crasher obsidian statue shenanigans, something like that. But obviously there has not been a deck to utilize this yet. And of course, a card like this compared to a card like Countess Ashmore, it's a bit of an unfair comparison. I did want to use a strict, well-defined metric to rank this list, but I do honestly think Countess Ashmore is a more overrated card, a more disappointing card, because with a card like Coffin Crasher, it's a class card first off, so the likelihood of it being in decks is much, much lower, but also it's a very specific synergy-based class card as well, so unless it has a deck, it's just not going to be played at all. Countess Ashmore, you can still kind of squeeze into stuff. So you could flip these rankings, I certainly wouldn't debate you. It makes a lot of sense to do it that way. I did want to strictly stick to the numerical explanation for these rankings because I defined them that way. But in reality, this was still a very clearly disappointing card. Failed people's expectations enormously. I mean, just 84 spots lower than we thought. Practically opposite ends of the scale, right? From one of the best in cards to one of the very worst imaginable cards outside of like the filler cards. I mean, there's always like 20 cards that everybody knows are garbage. This barely escaped filler card territory. So just a totally absurd, absolutely ridiculous drop-off here for Coffin Crasher. And numerically speaking, by far, the most disappointing card from the Witchwood. And there you have it, guys. There's my list. No matter how you rank these, clearly all have fallen short of what people expected of them. Not nearly as strong as most of us went into this believing. And, you know, it's hard to get things right. This isn't like an indictment of the community or a judgment, because clearly I get it wrong myself. But it's hard to guess whether a card's going to be really good. You can usually guess with some accuracy when a card's going to be weak. It's really, really hard to figure out what stuff is going to be strong, just because you never know how the meta is going to look. You don't know how things are going to shape up. That's why I personally prefer to judge the fundamental attributes of a card as opposed to its likelihood to be played. And by that metric, I'm not sure these cards can safely be named disappointments just yet. I think, in fact, a majority of this list will come to see play at some point or another. But in the interest of science and fairness and objectivity, I went ahead and ranked this list based on the data we have available now, and that means these are disappointing at the moment. You can argue the merits of that system, but the system says these cards fell the farthest from our expectations and therefore were the most disappointing of all. Now that said, I'm curious, what other cards do you guys think have been a disappointment? What can turn these cards around? What deck have you found success with when it comes to playing these cards, and you're going to convince us all these aren't a disappointment at all and they should be played a ton? I want to hear all of that in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.